So, Melissa, I will turn it over to you to call us to order.
Okay, we'll call the meeting to order. And Doug, I'll have you do roll call.
Okay. Melissa,
Here.
present. Robert Bonner is excused. I got a last minute email from him. He had a conflict. Gabriel? I see him. Can't hear you, Gabriel, but I got your hand message. You're here. Dominic resigned today. He had family conflicts. So we're down another body. So Leslie?
Here.
Irma? Irma's here. And Robert?
Can you see me now?
I can see you now. So that is our roll. So, Melissa, I'll turn it back over to you for the minutes.
Okay, so it looks like the minutes from last time, did we not have a quorum, so we didn't approve?
So our last meeting was on the 20th.
Oh, it's just saying
So-
what I said. But okay.
Yeah.
I get it.
These
Okay.
minutes are from your last meeting.
Okay. All right. Well, I will make a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting. It looks like either Gabriel or Leslie will need to be the ones to make that motion.
To make the motion or second it?
Well,
need to do a
maybe
sec-
like both, probably, just because we're the only ones that were there.
I motion to approve the minutes from our last meeting.
Okay.
Gabriel's making a motion to second. And I'll approve. Aye.
Thumbs up. Passed.
All right.
So here's where we have the opportunity. We're going to turn this over to Elizabeth and to Heather. They have a PowerPoint they're going to go through tonight. So this is our next iteration on the code language. You had some at your last meeting. We're going to go through it again in more detail this evening. And then we have a meeting in March, on March 10th, I believe it is. And that's where you will do your last version and review of the duplex standards and the draft of, as we're working towards the code ready other middle housing components. So Elizabeth, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Doug. Thank you, members of the committee, for being here tonight. Before we turn to that PowerPoint, because you know I've always got one, just some quick introductions. Just want you to be aware we also have Heather Austin from our team on the line. And we were both, in the trenches writing that code. So we'll be, sort of tag teaming some of the issues, and she'll jump in and correct me as needed. And then also, I'm not sure if any of you have met Robert Manzalillo, right? Lillo, not Lilo.
Yep, that's right.
And Robert is with the housing team at DLCD. And so he can jump in and correct me if I grossly misstate what the state requirements are. In fact,
I have not heard that yet, so I don't think I'll be jumping in at all.
Sure. Well, I'll give you a heads up. We're kind of revisiting the performance metric as an alternative. Not that we're recommending it, but you can jump in there if I misstate. I might have an old graphic, but the point is the same. So that is, we have ample resources on our call tonight. So thank you all for being here. With that, let's get this started. Hope everybody is doing well with the aftermath of the storm here. And I appreciate you all spending your evening. As Doug said, we get to talk about the middle housing code updates, and hopefully they will not be missing middle for much longer. On our agenda, we have two packages of code to walk through. As you probably saw in your very lengthy packets, we have the duplex code that includes some provisions for the master plans, specifically the Springbrook master plan, as well as a second packet that has all the middle housing code, that has the code updates for all the other middle housing types. And so that second packet really builds on the duplex code. And so, I wish that we would have mentioned in our cover memo, you could have saved yourself a step by just reading the second version, because it included both the duplex and the middle housing code. But by looking at them separately, you can sort of see how we're layering these on top of each other. So we'll walk through those two sets of codes and then talk about next steps. As Doug sort of mentioned, we have a couple more meetings coming up. It's pretty intense for the next month or so on this Newburgh project, helping you guys get the duplex code moving forward to meet the June 30th deadline. And then I think, you guys, the meetings will really kind of taper off, and we'll be working in the background. But, as the agenda alludes to, we have two packages of code because there's two different sets of requirements that we're trying to meet. So our first and foremost goal is getting this duplex code done. It needs to be adopted by the end of June this year. So what we'd love to do is walk through the recommended draft that's before you tonight, get your final feedback on that, and we'll also be incorporating feedback from the open house, and that helps us head straight into the first work session we have with Planning Commission and City Council on March 15th. So, there certainly are additional opportunities past tonight if you would like to provide feedback, but we would really love to get the bulk of your comments tonight and to provide any more direction to us on that. And then the second piece is we're going to build on that, but it will come forward as a separate set of code amendments to deal with the other middle housing types. So that's the triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters. And the city will be working on a separate adoption process for that in fall of 2021. And the reason that these are bifurcated is that we have to meet this June 30th deadline for the duplex, because based on how Newburgh is classified as a medium-sized city, the other housing types, the city will trigger required compliance with that when the population passes 25,000. And before then, we're just getting ready. And also the city is, being proactive about implementing some steps to expand housing options. Okay, so we'll sort of talk about all the impacts of these two codes together, but just as a technical matter, they will be moving forward for adoption separately. Ultimately, they'll work together though. So any questions on that before we dive into a few duplex specifics? Okay, I'll assume you're not fumbling for your unmute buttons. So, big picture for the duplex code, as we went over last time, we're amending the definition for duplex dwellings to allow both the attached and the detached. We're allowing duplexes with the same requirements as single family detached dwellings. That's that SFDD acronym we threw in here. In the residential zones, the R1, R2, R3, RP, and AR zones. And we're making sure that in those zones, duplexes are allowed on the same size lots as single family detached dwellings. But on those lots, we're maintaining the existing dimensional standards for the most part. We'll talk about one possible change to the height, so that the height and setbacks and lot coverage that apply to a duplex is the same as for a single family detached dwelling. The idea being that sort of the building envelope is going to be about the same regardless of how many dwelling units it's split up into on the inside. And we're also revising the parking requirement for duplexes so that the minimum is 1 per dwelling unit. Okay. So we did have a couple final, sort of fine-tuning questions that we wanted to get your input on. So the first has to do with those minimum lot sizes. So as I mentioned, the minimum lot size in our is the same for single family detached dwellings and duplexes. So in R1, that's 5,000, and then in R2, R3, and RP, that's 3,000, and AR is also 5,000. And if you moved up into multifamily, you'd see that you get to have essentially 1 dwelling unit for this many square feet. It could be a larger lot in total. But the main thing that I want to draw your attention to is that this 3,000 square foot minimum lot size for a single family detached dwelling is the same for R3, R2, and RP. But R3 is like generally supposed to be a more dense zone than R2. You know, the numbers are somewhat sequential. And so, you know, I mean, the middle housing is definitely blurring that distinction as we're introducing more housing units. But the question is, you know, do you think that it could be appropriate to allow a smaller minimum lot size for single family detached dwellings and duplexes in the R3 that would reflect, you know, that opportunity for greater density? So to be, you know, smaller lots could be, you know, I guess I would recommend talking about a 2,000 or 2,500 square foot size if you're interested in reducing it. And, you know, in addition to that transect, I think the, you know, in terms of increasing density, the other reason that you might consider it is when you look at this minimum lot area per dwelling, right? In the R2 zone, in comparison, you could build a duplex or a single family on 3,000 square feet of lot, which is, you know, more dense than multifamily could be. But when you move over to R3, a duplex, you know, at 3,000 square feet is really the same density as multifamily. And so, I don't, you know, is that right? Or do we want to bring that lot size down just to add a little bit more of an opportunity there? It could be somewhat of a moot point. I don't know how many duplexes are really going to get built on a 2,000 or 2,500 square foot lot, but we wanted to give you a chance to think that through. So I've got just a couple questions to go through, and then we can come back and have discussion on all of them. So next one that we wanted to talk to you about is building height. And we talked at length about this in the last meeting. And so we worked through a lot of the suggestions and some comparisons to other cities and other options. And the proposal that we came up with is based, the current requirement is a 30-foot maximum height for R1, R2, RP, and AR, and 45 feet in R3. Again, that's the denser zone. And we were considering, you know, should it go up to 35 feet in all or some of those zones that would allow, you know, full 3 stories. And so the proposal that we brought back to you is to maintain that 30-foot maximum height in the R1 zone. That's sort of the lowest density, lowest intensity zone traditionally, but to allow that 35 feet in the R2, the RP, and the AR zones. Just the idea being that there's sort of a gradation and a slightly more intensive uses that could be permitted in those zones. So that's our proposal, and we're looking for your feedback to confirm or refine that further. You know, if you want to keep all of those at 30 feet, increase all of them to 35, or do sort of this hybrid proposal that we came up with. Okay, and next one has to do with access standards. And, you know, here is one where, Robert, if you want to jump in, because we've been sort of, you know, going over this at the state level, trying to interpret some of these provisions. But what we're trying to get at is thinking about for duplexes, right? You've got 2 units. And should there be a guarantee in the code that a lot with a duplex, you know, can always have 2 driveways, or that it should always be limited to 1 so that it's consolidated and more like a single family detached dwelling, you know, or should there be some variation? Some of the reasons for variation in the code could be, for example, on a corner lot, it might make more sense to have 2 driveways on the different frontages versus on an interior lot in the middle of the block. You also probably would consider some variations based on street classification. So if it's a local residential street, oftentimes access standards are more permissive than on a major arterial or collector, you know, busier commercial street. So that might change how many driveways that would be allowed through code. So our recommendation is to allow but not require 2 driveways for corner lots on local streets. And then to allow on other lots, to allow those 2 driveways if the 40-foot spacing can be met. And that's the existing standard in the code. So for single family detached dwellings and other lots, if you can achieve 40-foot spacing between the 2 driveways, it is permissible to add 2 driveways to a single lot. So the idea being that's the existing standard, and we would just continue to apply it to duplexes. And the result would be that most duplex lots, or many at least, based on that spacing, and if you add up the 40 feet plus the width of the two driveways, that gets to be a pretty wide lot. So in actuality, many of those lots will have a single double wide driveway that is shared by the two units. Which means, as you see some pictures, this is probably a pretty common design paradigm that you might see, how the driveways are shared. There's one curb cut, and then what's nice about it also is the garages wind up sharing a common wall, which is, a less occupied, a less busy, living area. So it's sort of a nicer buffer area that can help buffer some of the main living area in the house. Here's a corner duplex. You can just see a white car poking out on the right side. And if you go all the way around, I think there's another driveway on that side, but that's one option. How it could be arranged. And you can see that both those driveways are pushed as far from the corner as possible to avoid conflicts at the intersection, or to minimize conflicts. So that is our proposal. We've got those 3 questions for you about whether to decrease the lot size for R3, if you concur with the height proposal to increase to 35 feet in select zones, and if you have any thoughts about this access issue, that we'd stop. And of course, any other questions or comments you have about the duplex code draft in front of you tonight. So we'll turn it over to you for some discussion.
Could you put the slide up that summarized the 3 questions or the 3 decisions?
I apologize. I don't seem to have a summary slide. So I can just go back to the first one and we can take them one by one. Yeah, that's what I was looking for too.
Can you explain what you meant when you said that in R3, you would have more density on a single family lot than you would on multifamily? How it's set up now?
Sure. What I was trying to say is that the contrast is in R2, you could build a single family home or a duplex on 3,000 square feet. And if you built a multifamily, you could have 1 unit per 3,000 square feet. So you get parity between, a single family detached dwelling and multifamily is essentially at the same density. But duplexes just sort of benefit from this in that they get to be more dense, right? Having 2 units on that 3,000 square foot lot is more dense than having multifamily at 1 unit per 3,000. But in R3, the duplexes don't really get that preferential treatment. And, maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but it's distinct and different from the rest of these zones where the 3,000 square foot is required for the single family detached as well as the duplexes. So if anyone's building a single family detached in R3, it takes twice as much land to build a single family detached as it does to build 1 apartment unit. So like you're sort of cutting your density potential in half for single family detached. And that really eliminates sort of that bonus option for a duplex. There's less of a density incentive is one way to put it. And that could be a good thing. It's entirely possible that it makes sense to use the R3 zone primarily for apartments. And so if you keep these standards as they are, one way to read them is, oh, well, I can get the most units by building apartments, so I might as well do that in this zone. So hopefully that would be an incentive. But on the other hand, if people are choosing to build single family and they have to meet this 3,000, they're sort of missing an opportunity to provide some density and maybe not using that R3 land as efficiently as possible.
I thought multifamily was on commercial zone.
It is I actually haven't reviewed the commercial zones. There's also the R4 zone, which is the highest density zone. And there is additional apartment opportunities there. And I think that you're right. There are some additional multifamily opportunities in the commercial zone, but Doug, Doug
Yeah.
can jump in there.
So what we currently allow in our C2 zone is that you can go through a conditional use process before the planning commission, and you can put residential development on a C2. And the planning commission is the one that determines what the density is going to be. There's an additional provision that you could get a conditional use for housing in R2. And you can also do a planned unit development. And then there's some very prescriptive standards based upon bedroom units or number of bedrooms. You get certain number of points. And so we've had some developments who have actually, and the most current one is the one that's under construction now, across from the hospital, is, basically 3/4 of that site is zone commercial. And what you're going to end up seeing is apartments and detached single family homes on very small lots approved through a PUD process and a conditional use process.
So if we had a 2,500 square foot lot with a duplex, what, Doug, do you think would be about the size of each unit?
Oh, each unit would probably be somewhere between 1,200 to 1,600 square feet.
Yeah.
I think what Elizabeth is getting at is, and we have not seen historically a lot of duplex development in R3 land. We have some severe limitations on the amount of R3 land that we already have. And so market conditions is the R3 has really gone to truly the multifamily. And so as we go through in the draft of the work that Elizabeth did, is now we're looking at multifamily as 5 units and above. And so most of our R3 land is really the higher density apartments. We have maybe a few situations where we've got some duplexes or triplexes, or even a few quads on some R3, but they're really lots of record. They're small. They really couldn't do an apartment project. They couldn't meet all the parking requirements and landscape requirements. And so the developers chose to go to the duplex or quad type of development product. So from my perspective, if we went down to 2,000 or 2,500 square feet for a duplex in R3, no harm, no foul. It just provides some more flexibility and options. Really, our goal in the R3 is to really get that density and try to get those multifamily units of 5 and above.
Sure, and I guess, with that sort of history of the building on the ground, you could go either way, but if you keep the 3,000, it might continue to encourage that multifamily, which could be the more desirable outcome, and focus on the duplexes and some of the other zones. It's just sort of a question, do you want to incentivize duplexes, sort of not necessarily at the expense of multifamily, but just as an alternative? But multifamily certainly provides a lot of valid, needed housing options as well.
So I don't see a hand raised thing. Yeah, I don't see that being a problem either. I don't know that we're going to get a lot of demand to be building duplexes on those lots, might be self-regulating, I don't know. But as far as the increase on the height, I think you were saying 35.
Yep. Great, good segue.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and this question goes out to everybody. What kind of repercussions do we anticipate by raising it 5 feet? I mean, what are the possibilities, hypothetical?
Well, part of that conversation we had at the last meeting was you went to 35 feet in R1, is that the development community can say, oh, now I can truly get a 3-story house instead of a 2.5. And so they go to 3. We also talked about the fact that the land that we have left to develop we're starting to get into the slopey areas. And that is requiring some creative activities on the part of the developer to meet the 30-foot structure height. So they're actually having to build the foundation, build the stem walls, build a retaining wall for the unit, then backfill against the building, the dirt, in order to meet our definition for structure height, which mirrors what's in the Oregon Structural Specialty Code. And so we're going to see more of that as we continue to go up north, where primarily our residential development will occur. We start to get up to the base of the hills.
Is there a possibility that if you are up in the hill, just go 35 feet, and if you are downside, you can go to 45 feet, or it have to be only one side?
Well, so what we're talking about really is in the R1. So our R3 already allows 45 feet. And then we have some step back provisions that if you're next to R1, you can go to a certain height, and you get 50 feet back, then you can go up to that 45 feet. So we're trying to make that transition so there's compatibility between these true multifamily projects and these single family homes, which would now include the duplexes. If you got into a situation where you said, oh, if we're in the hills, we could go to 35 feet. If you're in the flat, then we got to pick a topography number. And that's kind of arbitrary. And it would be challenging for staff to try to implement something like that.
Got it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the proposal that we came up with is sort of a hybrid option to reflect that, the R2, RP, and AR zones maybe have some opportunity to go to 35, but that R1 zone could stay at 30 feet. But I guess, Doug, those sloped areas that we're talking about, what are those primarily zoned? Would this proposal help that, or should we also be looking at 35 for R1?
It would be R1 as well. So a lot of our future development, think of it this way, is 1,345 future units are going to be in the Springbrook Master Plan.
Mm-hmm.
And in that master plan, and I can't tell you the number, we're starting to push our way up the hill towards Bell Road. And so, yes, we could keep the 30 feet, and the developers can be creative about how they contour the site, so to speak. And that would create or be consistent with some uniformity that we've had for decades on structure height in R1. But increasing that height in the R2, RP, and the AR zone, as Elizabeth said, it gives us some more flexibility and some creativity about what they can do to try to ensure that we're getting more units. And I think that's a message that I will continue to come back at as we're finishing up our housing needs analysis, is to get more units and be more efficient with the land supply that we currently have.
Well, my final thought, you guys have a handle on it. I think that very pragmatic approach. I'd agree to maintain the 30 in the R1 and increase, in the commercial, where we want to put the higher density housing. So.
And it also could be, I think of it this way, is in our R2 zone, our target density is 9.5 dwelling units per acre. And what we've historically seen based upon our HNA work is that we're only at 7.5. So if you increase that height by 5 feet, that could lead the market to respond to say, oh, I want to do some more multifamily housing, which the HNA identifies as we want more multifamily housing. It's cost effective to try to do that. So some of our existing regulations have driven us to, in the R2, is that developers have done detached single family homes rather than going to the multifamily because of the limitations on the height.
Okay. Any other height thoughts before we talk about what is our last? Oh, the driveways.
Yeah, I think I just, from kind of a consensus point from the committee, maybe as we kind of go through this, Elizabeth, is, do you generally agree? We're not taking a vote, but it'd be good to kind of hear from everybody. It's like, yeah, 30 feet in R1 is okay. 35 feet in R2, RP, and AR, that's okay. Robert's already shared his thoughts. What about the others?
I feel like the proposal's okay. I mean, and if we're looking at producing more units, adding 5 feet in R1 might not, really achieve that. And yes, but then if you're adding that additional 5 feet in R2, you could add enough floor area with that extra, level to encourage building 2 units possibly instead of 1. So, I mean, I think this sounds fine.
I agree. I like allowing more flexibility and giving hopefully more incentive for duplexes or more multifamily dwelling. I think we need that in Newburgh.
I agree too.
Yes, and the same, the flexibility is there if we allow higher, specifically when we get into narrow, because then we are limited, we cannot go wider, so we go higher and we have the limit there.
Yeah, great. And we're going to build on this. I should mention, we're going to build on what we decide for duplexes when we get into the townhouses and the other plexes that could definitely be those narrower configurations. Okay, let's see. Did we get everybody?
I think we did on that one, Elizabeth.
Oh, nice. Well, thank you all for jumping in. Okay, so the next piece is access. And, I think that we've got a recommendation here, but I'll also say we have a meeting scheduled tomorrow with the engineering division. So we're going to be getting, their input. We're going to keep working through this. Some of the implications here with DLCD staff to understand, how good engineering principles overlaps with zoning and we can still comply with the state requirements. So we're really just sort of looking for some general preferences. It doesn't have to be a final opinion right now, but thinking about these different situations, corner lots, interior lots, local streets, busier streets, shall we say? It's an official engineering term. What are the thoughts about whether you'd like to see 2 driveways or a single shared driveway or a mix, depending on the situation?
I think it will be mixed, depends on the situation, but it also the one from the corners. I don't think, personally, I think it's difficult. But I like the first picture that you put, the one that they sharing that one, you're sharing that one. I think those are very good.
Okay.
Sharing driveway, something like that. Yeah, that one.
Great.
But the other one that you put, the one in the corner, yeah, that one is gonna be more easier to park in the street than go into the parking lot, because then you have to reverse and traffic are coming and
Sure. Okay, other thoughts on these options?
I'll chime in. I would agree with staff recommendations. I would, I guess, reiterate the need for a driveway per unit. Obviously, there's more room in a corner lot, so I mean, looks like you guys have thought this through, and yeah.
Okay, Thank you.
I agree with the recommendations as they are. I think they make sense.
Thanks.
I do as well.
Yep, no other ideas.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you all. Any other thoughts sort of on duplexes as you read through? I know that, you know, we took a more comprehensive looks last times, but if there's anything you forgot to ask or that came up on a second reading, we have a chance to talk about it now.
I guess I missed the last meeting. I was in Montana. Doug reminded me of that, and I just realized that's where I was.
I wasn't there too. I wasn't able to connect, so I was not in the last meeting either.
So I probably missed some stuff. We probably missed some stuff.
Yep.
Sure. I mean, I think that the main, here we are. The main points of our duplex code is that we're going to allow these attached or detached dwellings. That was the direction we heard. We're going to allow them in all of the, these residential zones on the same size lots. We just looked at that table. We're going to keep the existing dimensional standards with the exception of those height changes, but all the setbacks and the lot coverage stay the same. And then the parking requirement, we're proposing to change to 1 per dwelling unit rather than 2 per unit. But we're not proposing any further reductions to parking, which are permitted under the state code.
So I have a couple thoughts. I mean, just so these are great incentives to build middle row housing, something that we need. So are we going to monitor the permits as we go forward? And if we're still seeing a lack of middle row housing development, where do we go from there? What do we do? Because I mean, I think
Great question. So I would say that yes, the city will be monitoring. They are required to report to the state, actually. I think it's an annual basis. Am I making this up?
Yeah. Yes. We're going to have reporting to do.
Yes, there will be reporting, and then there will be, the city is going through as Doug mentioned, the housing needs analysis process right now of analyzing what housing is available and what the local needs are. And so future HNAs will incorporate all of the, middle housing that gets built and assessing that against the local need. And if I think that's sort of where the answer will come, like, is quote unquote enough middle housing being built? Future HNAs will be able to answer that if the need for housing is being met. And there is always an opportunity to come back and revise code. I would say that code is generally sort of the first piece of the puzzle, right? Making sure that the types of development that is needed in the community is permitted. And then you can come back to code, but there's also, sort of a range of other financial and policy options that the city can be looking at. Those also often are addressed as recommendations in an HNA, or city will be working eventually down the road on, us planners, we are the worst, another acronym, a housing strategy implementation plan, HSIP, is sort of takes the HNA one step further and makes some more recommendations about that full suite of policy options. So in short, the code is the first step, and we'll continue to monitor it and look at other options as needed to meet the housing need.
Yeah, and I would add to that is effective January 1st, which was a holiday, we've actually revised our reporting. So we're keeping track on a monthly basis for all detached single families, duplexes, triplexes, quads. cottage clusters, townhomes, and accessory dwelling units. Because we have more than one reporting requirement that we have to provide to either DLCD or the Oregon Housing Community Services. So I toggled Robert and changed how we're tracking everything.
Cool. So just out of curiosity, about roughly, are we seeing a uptick in any development of middle row housing?
Yes, it's in the works. And so we're actually seeing some duplex development proposals
Okay.
that have come through. We've had some pre-app meetings on some other duplex proposals. Nobody has come forward with any tri or quadplex proposals. We have developers interested in a cottage cluster type of development. They're kind of waiting until we get regulations on the books, because what we have today, they couldn't do what they want to do. And we already have some townhouse regulations in the code, but if you read through one of the attachments in your packet, is that we need to make revisions in order to meet the administrative rule requirements for those.
I got a question. It's gonna be a way that the city will monitor how many detached and attached are gonna be building, or this is just once it's approved, the city won't have a count and how many detached and attached duplex will be building.
Yeah, so what we're doing is we're tracking data for units that have been submitted in for building permit review. And then, so that's kind of the permitting side of it. And then we're looking at the production side, what units have been constructed and completed and been given a final occupancy. And so we're tracking both of those data so we can see what's permitted and what's actually been produced on the ground. And so there is always a time delay in the reporting process. There's no perfect system. And so, you know, we may permit a unit, and we're tracking this on an annual basis and a fiscal basis. But if I went to the annual basis, calendar year, we may have permitted a unit in November, but it wasn't constructed. So you end up in the permitted category. The next year it would show up that that was a produced unit on the ground.
Okay. And the next question is, these codes that are presenting here today, if everything is approved, are these new codes are going to affect the duplex that are being built already or not?
It would not affect those that are under construction today. What it would apply to is units that would get apply for permits after the code is adopted. So think of it this way. We are scheduled to go to council on June 7th for a public hearing on the duplex provisions. Council adopts that ordinance goes into effect 30 days later. So roughly July 7th. So any application that would come in after July 7th would have to adhere to or comply with the new regulations. An application that came in before July 7th would have to comply with the old regulations.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for all these thoughts about how this is actually going to work, right? That's the exciting part. Another piece that sort of a bridge section of our presentation is one of the things that's unique about Newburgh is the number of master plans that you have. And much of the city's buildable area is located in, you know, sort of areas along the city's perimeter that have a master plan already approved. So under the new state regulations for middle housing, these master plan areas are treated a little differently. You know, in recognition that a lot of work has gone into these master plans and there's a specific vision and, you know, that planning efforts and infrastructure and engineering efforts have gone into it. So we've got 5 that we're addressing here in Newburgh: the Airport Residential, Springbrook, Northwest Newburgh, Springbrook Oaks, and Riverfront. And, we just want to assure you, we are tracking these and making changes to them as needed. The big one that really stands out, probably worthy of most of your attention, is the Springbrook district. And so it has a master plan. Sorry, my apologies. So Springbrook has a master plan, and we have included changing the use table in that master plan to allow duplexes where single family is permitted. The other thing that's unique about Springbrook is that most of it is not built out yet. So a lot of these other master plans have already been built. So, even though we change it to duplexes, it's fairly new construction. It's not going to infill overnight. People aren't going to go out and tear down a 5-year-old single family home and replace it with a duplex, no matter what we permit. So Springbrook is really the one to watch, and there are some proposed revisions to that matrix in your packet. And as we move to the other middle housing types, the triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters, there's really two main options that the state has outlined to comply with middle housing requirements. So the first is to just treat the master plans the same as the base zones, essentially just allow all the middle housing types on lots meeting the minimum lot sizes, the same as everywhere else in the city. The second option is that within those approved master plan areas, there is an option to limit to single family detached dwellings and duplexes for initial development, right, of lots that are empty effectively right now. It doesn't affect, future infill of those lots or conversion. But you can only sort of impose this duplex limitation if the master plan area is already meeting an overall minimum density of 8 units per acre. That's sort of the compromise that they struck. And so our recommendation, we went through and evaluated these master plans. Most of them, are at or are meeting the 8 units per acre. But again, most of them are pretty built out, so it's not going to be as much of an impact. Again, Springbrook is the one that we're most keeping an eye on. And in that one, the density is much lower than 8 units per acre. So our assessment is that it would actually take more work and be more impactful to, how the area is planned to bring that density up to 8 than to just, permit all of these middle housing types, and then the market builds what the market builds within infrastructure constraints within, that can be served by the infrastructure being built for that area. So what we're proposing to do is to go through in this second round and do a similar update to most of the master plans to add the full range of middle housing types, including within the Springbrook plan, rather than invoking this option to limit to just duplexes, because that 8 units per acre threshold, makes it more complicated. So that's our recommendation. Any thoughts on that before we move past middle housing, or any questions or clarifications?
I'll be surprised if there is any multifamily in some of those, in that in Springbrook area. I mean, those are big lots and those are expensive.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And I think it gets to a point like we can change things in code, but developers and builders and the market, the prices, those are all sending strong signals about what kind of development is planned as well. So in some ways it's just easier to, change some rules on paper to meet the code than it is to, force anyone to build anything.
Yeah, there would be a lot of work to go back through all of these specific plans and master plans. I don't know if Robert has that kind of money in his budget that we would need.
I don't think so.
I just need a mere $100,000 or so to go back and amend all of these plans. And so as Elizabeth and Steve and Heather and I've talked about, just allowing all of the middle housing in all of these specific or master plan areas is a simple, and then the market will respond accordingly.
And if I could say, this is an interesting situation because when we wrote the master plan regulations, we really had it in for large cities. Thinking really of Wilsonville, Hillsborough, Beaverton. So the fact that Newburgh's a medium-sized city and dealing with master planned issues is something I don't think we really took into consideration, because you only have to comply with the duplex part of this. But if you want to add all the middle housing types to these, that's wonderful.
And that's something our council early on, when I went to them and said, do you want to do just the duplexes? That's what we're required to do. Or do you want to do all of the other middle housing? And they said, we want to do it all. So that put us on our path. And that's how we applied for our grant, is to address all of it. Not knowing clearly at the time that we were making that request, is that, oh, here's all these specific master plans. And so as Elizabeth and the team have dove into this, we've found some interesting nuances in Newburgh. And how do we make this work?
Yeah, right. And Newburgh is really unique in having all these master plans. I'm sure Robert's working in more cities than I am, but I'm doing 4 right now. And even if I think of other cities I've worked in, I can't think of any, or none of the other 4, let me say, have a single master plan between them. So you all have cornered the market.
We are at the bend of the Willamette River, so we are unique and different.
You are very innovative. But I think that as we've worked through this issue, the recommendation is to really not disregard the master plans, but to apply a very similar approach within the master planned areas as elsewhere. So I think that helps us, get to an outcome that's going to be the most feasible to implement within our time frame, and really in the end be the most compatible with the existing plans, and really just let the builders and the developers and the market decide. Okay, so with that, let's transition to our other middle housing code. So quick refresher, we are looking at triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters for quote unquote other middle housing. So the first question that we're dealing with is where to permit middle housing. And so HB 2001 differentiates that duplexes have to be on every lot or parcel where single family detached dwellings are permitted, but these other middle housing types have to be allowed in quote in areas with residential area zoning. And so there was a lengthy, months-long debate, months of Robert's life that he will never get back, that was spent debating what exactly in areas means. And so what it boils down to for cities is that we really have a chance, and again, this is for the other middle housing types, as Newburgh approaches that large city, is you can adopt what's called the whittle away approach, which essentially means you take all the areas with residential zoning, basically every lot or parcel, but then you whittle away areas where it doesn't make sense to allow this higher middle housing. And so that means you're going to take away what's termed goal protected lands. So areas where there are other statewide planning goals that preclude development of more dense development. So places that are in a flood hazard, places that are in a natural hazard, places that are within the Willamette Greenway, for example. So you take away, there's sort of a list of these different ones that we're going to whittle away, and then whatever's left, any lots in those areas that meet the minimum lot sizes, are eligible for these other housing types. And then the alternative is what's termed the performance approach. And the idea is that, if cities say, we just don't want to allow it in all areas and the whittle away just isn't satisfying to us, cities can demonstrate, sort of a good faith effort by ensuring that a minimum percentage of lots in residential areas are permitted for each middle housing type, with the option, to then exclude middle housing types on, the remaining percentage of lots. And we recommend and have based the code recommendations on using this whittle away approach. That seems to be the prevalent approach, and really has simplicity behind it. It's much easier to define what are these goal protected areas and to take those out of the equation than to try to figure out how to apply, frankly, this performance approach. So this is a graphic that maybe is a little outdated. I can't remember if the percentages got updated, but you know, the overall idea here is that if a city can show that, you know, 80% of lots are allowed for triplexes, meaning that those lots meet the minimum lot size for triplexes, and likewise for quadplexes, if you can say 70% of our lots are able to do quadplexes, then 30% of your lots don't have to. And then, you know, it applies to these other housing types as well. But what this requires is a very nuanced, detailed, you know, GIS analysis of every lot in the city and an ability to demonstrate that you really do, you know, you have to show we're performing, we're meeting these 80%. And I think Robert can maybe tell us that the city or the state went through this exercise for a few cities, and it's actually kind of a toss-up. For some cities, you have to allow these middle housing types on more lots through the performance approach than through the whittle away approach. And so, and it also just takes so much more time to go through that to try to figure out what the answer is. So that's why we're recommending the whittle away approach. We also think that it allows more middle housing in a more straightforward manner for everyone to understand and to expand these housing opportunities in the city. So that is why we're starting with this premise that every lot that is not, you know, protected by a different planning goal or subject to a certain planning hazard, or could be subject to hazards, and meets the minimum lot size should be allowed to develop with these middle housing types. So any questions about that or additional commentary from experts? Oh, that is not what I meant to do.
I think just if I was to share with the committee is to go with the whittle approach, as Elizabeth has recommended. It's to go through the mathematical gyrations to try to go through the performance-based time and money, time and money to try to go through all of that. And again, you know, by allowing all of these other middle housing types, is again, the market will respond. Willing seller, willing buyer, developer has a development concept. They'll bring that forward. They know what works for them. And we're going to get a mix of things.
Great. Okay, so the one question that we did have sort of, you know, presuming this whittle away approach is, you know, as I understand, I am not a hazard planner, let me just tell you all. But what I understand is in the stream corridor overlay, right? That's where we could have some flooding issues. There is an option the city could limit some of these other middle housing types there, or they could permit them just as they do, you know, in all the base zones. And so the question for this group is, you know, is there desire to limit these housing types within that overlay, you know, to try to limit impacts to the resource area and, you know, potential risk to, you know, people and property. If you know, hypothetically, if you had a quadplex, you might have more people and a larger structure. Not always, right? It always depends on, you know, the exact dwelling units that are produced and who's living there. You could have a family of 12 in a gigantic single family home, but, you know, taking away hyperbole, that's sort of the rationale. I don't really have a strong opinion about this or not. It, you know, I think that, you know, there is some rationale to limit it, but also, you know, it's certainly simpler to just, you know, permit it the same as the base zones. So any thoughts about what we should do in the stream corridor?
I would just add that the way our current regulations are written is that if you had a detached single family home, is that we have a percentage limitation about what you, if you were doing an expansion of that home, of what could encroach within the stream corridor. We start with the basic premise, the stream corridor is a Goal 5 protected resource. And so we don't want structures in there. But we know we have nuances in situations where we have a home that may be right up against the edge. They have limited lot area. They want to do an expansion. And so the regulations were written so that they could do a small expansion within the stream corridor. If you started with a vacant lot and said, oh, you know, I want to put a quadplex in and I want to encroach within the stream corridor, our regulations are written such that, you know, you cannot do that. You got to follow the same thing as a single family. You can't build a single family in the stream corridor.
Right, and I think that that's a great point, Doug, that, you know, what we're proposing is that if these other housing types are permitted here, which is how the code is drafted, but by permitting them there, they would be subject to all the same limitations that apply to a single family detached dwelling in terms of impact and, you know, building envelope. So we're not proposing that somebody gets, you know, sort of a loophole to build some giant structure where it's not supposed to be. It's just a question of how many units you can divide it up to inside.
And the other nuance to that is if you had a existing detached single family home and somebody was converting it into a duplex and they wanted to do that, an expansion on a side of the duplex that would impact the stream corridor, they would follow the same regulations as a single family. So there's a percentage limitation.
I think that is something that we kind of need to talk more because Melissa was saying that what if a big family are there and then they're gonna require more parking, more people, more of everything.
Okay, yeah, other ideas?
Like how many rooms do they have, those stream corridors?
Well, they don't have rooms. And so it's actually a zoning overlay. And so back in 1995, 1996, the city went through a process to comply with the statewide planning goal, which is Goal 5, and did an inventory, hired a consultant, did an inventory of all of our stream corridors. So that's for Chehalem Creek and its tributaries, Hess Creek and its tributaries, and Springbrook Creek and its tributaries, and then the Willamette River. And through that analysis, it was both a part of it was an ecological assessment. So we may have areas where we may have a stream down at the bottom of a canyon. Let's take Hess Creek as an example. But the ecological advantages of going up near the top of the slope because of trees, I'll use the term, the birds and the bunnies that live in that particular environment. And so our stream corridors are wider than just the stream itself. It often goes up towards the top of the bank. Then we have situations where there may have been a stand of trees adjacent to that top of slope, which provided habitat for wildlife. And so selectively those areas were included. And so the premise is you don't build within the stream corridor. That's a protected area for wildlife, for water quality, and so forth. But we had situations where existing development had occurred and we have a stream corridor that comes right up to the corner of somebody's house. And then looking at, oh, well, if they wanted to do an expansion of their home in the future, where could they do that? And so the city at the time said, well, we're going to put a percentage limitation of how much you could expand into that stream corridor. And then we have requirements to do mitigation to mitigate that impact of actually doing a slight encroaching within the stream corridor. So you have to plant new trees, you have to indigenous plant species and so forth. So that's the basic premise for all of that. And so getting to your question about, having larger families, I'll use this scenario, if a family bought a home adjacent to a stream corridor, and to accommodate the family, they needed to add some additional bedrooms, they could apply to the city to do a minor encroachment into that stream corridor to add a couple of additional bedrooms. And we would look at that and determine, do you exceed the threshold or are you under the threshold? And then we would issue a decision for that. The other side of this is a developer comes in and says, oh, I have this vacant lot, and a quarter of that lot, it was within a stream corridor. We would say, just like a single family, you cannot build a new structure within that stream corridor. It's brand new development. You have to stay out of it. And so then they have to then figure out how they're going to put that unit on that developable area of that site. And so let's use a quad as a concept. Where do you position that quad? How do you deal with the parking? You're going to have on-street parking. So again, we're treating it exactly the same as we do our single family.
Thank you.
So it sounds like this would only apply then if a home was converted. Like, I don't understand why you would let development happen in these zones where there's a risk of flooding. Like, it just doesn't seem like that should happen. So,
well, I think
safety.
Yeah, Melissa, part of it is the stream corridors that we have in Newburgh are predominantly in incised channels. So there's been a lot of erosion for thousands and thousands of years. And so the stream may have been up at the general land elevation, but through that erosion, those channels have incised themselves and they've gone deeper and deeper. Hess Creek is the best example. If you go up to the headwaters of Hess Creek up by Bell Road, the channel is pretty synonymous with the surrounding topography. By the time you get down to George Fox, it's in the middle of a canyon. By the time you get down to Winooski Road, it's 70 feet down to the stream channel itself. And by the time you get to that stream channel connecting with Springbrook Creek, then it goes out into a floodplain of the Willamette River. So there's all these different dynamics that are taking place with all of these. So we also have floodplain regulations. Okay, I'm the floodplain manager, another title. And so we have regulations that you cannot build within the floodplain, right? But the floodplain is different than the stream corridor. The stream corridor is wider than the floodplain itself. And so we use the FEMA maps about where all of our floodplains are located.
Yeah,
so these encroachments are just on little pieces within a stream corridor, not within a floodplain, but it's usually up towards the top of a slope. And again, we allow some minor modifications to encroach just a little bit into that stream corridor for a single family home.
Yeah, and I do think you're right, Melissa, that most of the times that this actual question would come into play would be conversion of one of those existing single family homes rather than, a new construction.
Just out of curiosity, have you guys run into that before where someone bought a place and they decided they want to remodel it and then you told them no?
In my time with the city, we've had no applications for somebody to apply to expand the size of their dwelling unit into a stream corridor.
Yeah. So it's not really an issue.
It's very rare, but it was trying to recognize historic development patterns when we were putting this new zoning overlay on property and those limitations, and saying we needed to provide a little bit of concession given what the unknowns may be in the future. See, welcome to our complicated world that Elizabeth and Heather and I work into, and Robert. You know, it's not that simple.
I'm impressed how many codes you had to have for so many things. Okay.
Well, thank you. I'm impressed with all of you volunteering to try to understand and sort through all this. It takes me all day as a professional to try to figure out a tiny bit of it.
Wow.
So thank you all for trying to stick with this issue. I think, you know, that's a really good summary, and I should have asked you before the meeting, Doug. But yeah, if you've had 0 permits so far, you know, this is probably not going to be the most impactful decision you guys are going to make tonight. You know, we're talking relatively few dwellings, if any, that could be affected by this, and really just a question of, you know, should we allow some of the existing dwellings a little bit more flexibility in how they could hypothetically convert into the future. And
I guess that seems fine. I mean, it's going to affect relatively few properties anyways, and nothing that's built new, it sounds like.
And also this type of development, I assume something like that would be called right at the beginning. So it will be clear, no, we are not going there because it's, you know, there are limits. So look somewhere else where we can develop these middle housing structures.
yeah, okay, thanks. Okay, well, do we want to go around? Have we heard from everybody on this one? All right, well, relatively innocuous provision. Let's try the next one. So let's start with an overview. So if we're starting from this whittle away concept, which means that effectively, you know, the majority of the city, those lots are eligible for middle housing. The key code concepts to make these middle housing types viable and meet the state regulations, we're going to start like good planners in the definitions section, make sure that we amend all the definitions for middle housing and add in these new ideas. One of the carryover effects, as Doug alluded to earlier tonight, is that means that multifamily apartments are now going to be defined as 5 units and up. Right now it's 3 units and up. So if you want to build apartments, it's going to be bigger rather than a triplex or a quadplex. Okay, and then we're going to look at this same suite of residential zones, the R1, R2, R3, RP, and AR zones, and allow all those housing types across all those different zones. We're going to introduce the minimum lot sizes that are appropriate for these middle housing types. It's different than duplexes. It does not have to be the same as the lot sizes in the zones, in recognition that there's more units being talked about. And for the most part, are proposing to maintain the existing dimensional standards, the height and the setbacks like we were talking about, and lot coverage. But there's some fine tuning that we do recommend. Likewise, similar to the duplexes, we're looking at revising the parking requirements for 1 per dwelling unit for all these housing types. And then we talked at length at our last meeting about the different design standards that have been developed for these different middle housing types. And, you know, based on our discussion, what we're proposing and what you see in the draft tonight is to add all of these standards in effectively as written in the model code, you know, because of the work that went into that model code in developing those, and really that, you know, the options are sort of take it or leave it as far as the model code goes. So that's where we are starting tonight. And, you know, similar to duplexes, we have some questions for you. We also, just as a reminder, we're a little bit more preliminary in this draft. This is the first time we're bringing the draft to you tonight. So, you know, the more feedback you can give us, the more will help us refine the code and bring it back to you next month. We'll definitely continue working on it and getting some of these issues refined. So your feedback is really important. Will also be really our focus at the open house next week, which we'll talk about later. So what we're hoping to do. So the first sort of issue to talk through is about the minimum lot sizes and what we're proposing for these middle housing types. So the first thing to be aware of is that for triplexes, the way the state regulations sort of translate to the existing minimum lot sizes means that we are proposing a minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet for triplexes across all of the zones, 7,000 square foot size for quadplexes across all those zones. And then minimum lot size for townhouses is 1,500 square feet per townhouse with a 20-foot minimum lot width. And then cottages actually wind up being the same as quadplexes at 7,000 square feet. And these are really sort of the largest minimum lot sizes that can be permitted under the state code. We can't really bring them, we can't increase them any. We could bring them lower if you wanted to, but we felt like these were pretty reasonable to start with. So that's the proposal. And then the one area where there could be some further discussion is for townhouses. What's interesting to me is that for all these other housing types besides townhouses, there is no corresponding density limit. It's just these are the minimum lot sizes, and you know, if it's 3 units on 5,000 square feet, that's what it is. But for townhouses, it's actually a 2-part standard. Translated to Newburgh, the minimum lot size can't be any larger than 1,500 square feet, but the city could also limit townhouses to an overall density of 25 units per acre, which works out to, you know, a nice even 1,742 square feet per unit. And so I don't recommend this option because it's sort of, it's inconsistent with how we're treating all the other housing types to introduce, you know, this alternative density standard. And I also, you know, what's the point in allowing a 1,500 square foot minimum lot size if you can't actually build to that lot size because you have to meet a different density limit? And, you know, I think the rationale that I've heard is that, you know, the idea being that, you know, there's maybe an average lot size that maybe the corner units or the end units on a townhouse project would have larger lot sizes than the interior units. And so they wanted to hit that 1,500 square foot minimum lot size, but that the density could also be met if there were some slightly larger lots and it would be averaged. That's fine. You know, I still think, you know, 1,500 square feet is a minimum lot size. You can always have a larger lot if it's the corner lot, and you have to, you know, include that side yard or whatever for townhouses. But I don't think that the added complexity of adding this 25 units per acre is like a worthwhile code innovation. So we're not recommending that at this time. But I did want to make you aware of that option if there's particular concern over that. And I do actually have a slide summarizing all these questions. So we'll just sort of walk through and then come back for discussion on them all. The next one, you can tell I really went hard with the tables this time, but there's a lot of details to try to keep straight. So the next one is we're talking about lot coverage. And so right now in the code, the R1 generally has a 40% lot coverage, and all the other zones we're dealing with, the R2, R3, RP, and AR zone allow a 50% building coverage. And just to clarify, we're talking about building coverage that affects all the structures like the homes and the garage and, you know, any garage structures. It does not affect the other paved areas like the driveway. There's an additional allowance for that. So we're really just talking about how much building coverage is permitted. And so, you know, it's 40 to 50%. And if you take these minimum lot sizes in the top row that we're dealing with for these triplexes, quadplexes, and townhouses, I think it's less a concern for cottages because of the limitations on building footprints. So what I was hoping to do here is really just illustrate whether this lot coverage is, what it results in for these housing types, and whether it's sufficient, or whether there is an opportunity to increase. So what I tried to do here is, assuming that someone built to the full building coverage on these minimum lot sizes, that's how you get the allowed building footprint. That's sort of as big as the foundation could be. There could certainly be practical considerations about the lot that make it difficult to max out the footprint, but this is sort of the most possible. And then if you go back to our height discussion about whether it's 2.5 or 3 stories, I just multiplied that out to get to the total building area. Again, somebody might not choose to maximize either the footprint or the height, but if they did, that's sort of where they could get. And then for comparison's sake, since we're looking at triplexes with 3 units, quadplexes with 4, and townhouses with just 1, the bottom line, I think, is the most interesting to pay attention to in terms of the per unit area. So that's how much square footage hypothetically could be created per living unit, to see, is this feasible? Does it make a dwelling unit that, somehow balances both being, large enough to appeal to the market and to, a variety of households, but also not so large that it, pushes it completely outside the realm of the smaller scale, more affordable housing. And you can see the numbers really kind of range from, about 1,500 to 2,500. So, they're in somewhat within a range. I don't know if DLCD did this math also, and they're not wildly inconsistent. They're really all sort of in the same pocket. And to get above 1,600 per unit, and again, this, I don't know if this could actually be achieved on each lot, but in the max scenario, to get to that, those are pretty livable units. And I don't know that we need to concern ourselves about guaranteeing significantly more than, say, 2,500 square foot per unit. That more than that is really sort of beyond what any individual dwelling unit needs, I would say. But I think there's a few that really stand out as possibly meriting some increase for lot coverage, particularly since the garages are included, and we are including a requirement for 1 off-street parking space for all of these. And so I think the recommendation really builds off of the R1 issue and the way that we did the height. So we're recommending that the consider looking at increasing this building coverage to 60% for the other zones other than R1, and allowing 60% for townhouses in R1 as well as all the other zones. Particularly looking at an R1 townhouse that could only achieve 1,800 square feet as currently stated. And that includes most of the first floor as a garage. So you're only really looking at 1,200 square feet of living area. That could be pretty tight. So we think that in particular merits an increase up to 60%, which, gosh, I should have done the math on that, but I think would get us closer to 25, 9, 20, yeah, something like that. 27, yeah. So I think that there's some options there, but otherwise we didn't see, significant concerns about the existing lot coverage or building coverage, which is part of the total lot coverage. Okay, and then the next piece, we get to revisit this building height conversation, just as we talked about for duplexes. So we have a couple particular tweaks that we need to address. So townhouses need to be permitted up to 35 feet in all zones. And then cottages, sort of on the other end, we're gonna bring those to 25 feet. Those can be capped at a lower limit because cottages are supposed to be that smaller scale, which leaves us with triplexes and quadplexes. And under the state code, the height for those can be the same as single family detached dwellings. So, we don't have to make any further changes, but there are we are proposing, the carryover of those same revisions that we did with duplexes. So keep that 30 feet in the R1 zone and increase it to 35 in the R2, RP, and AR. So, assuming, that we made the changes we discussed for duplexes, this is how it would affect the other plexes. Okay, and then we get back to this design standards question that we talked about last week, or last month. And so our recommendation here is that we adopt the design standards in full from the model code for triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters. And to refresh your memory, those design issues for plexes and townhouses have to do with the entryway orientation, really making sure that there is a discernible entry that's oriented towards the street, and that these new units would pass what I call the trick or treat test. If your kid is trick or treating at night, could they find the front door when motivated by candy? And so that the door isn't really tucked far behind somewhere in the back, or that you just see the garage door from the front. For townhouses, there's this option, or there's this provision for unit definition to have a defining feature like a porch, a balcony, a window bay, excuse me, something like that. And then, across both of these, looking at a 15% minimum window coverage on the street facing facade. And then for both the garage and the off-street parking areas, limiting those to no more than 50% of that street facing facade. And then how we manage the driveway approaches to match those parking areas. So we're going to pick up on that driveway approach and access conversation, similar to the duplexes as we talked about. So generally, the goal behind these standards in the model code, as well as in Newburgh's code, is to limit driveways and garages so that they don't dominate that street frontage, so that it isn't just, one gigantic, driveway curb cut across the whole lot. But you want to limit that, but still allow, functional, meaningful access onto the public street. And we need to align whatever access we come up with for these plexes and the townhouses with our engineering standards, as we discussed, that address access and prevent some conflicts, on, say, close to intersections or on busier streets, or with facing driveways. And then there's also, sort of a whole category of issues around how these driveway cuts really impact the sidewalk and the street frontage and the experience walking along the street, both just from a visual standpoint, but also a real functional standpoint. The way that curb cuts can impact, accessibility and the ability, like walking along the street itself and crossing the pedestrian path, creating more vehicle conflicts. Everywhere that you have a curb cut for a driveway, you have taken away an option for on-street parking. So in some ways, more driveways is less parking. And there are ways that we can get at sort of consolidating where the curb space remains to maximize on-street parking. There are also impacts to street trees. If there is no frontage left and it's all just driveways, well, you can't plant street trees in the middle of a driveway. And then there's also some functional issues around utility placement. Where's the fire hydrant going to go? Where's the utility pole going to go? Some of the junction boxes that get sort of buried under that planter strip also need a place to go, and they sometimes need some spacing around them as well. So, there's a lot of things that get impacted by how many driveways get permitted. It's not just a question of, are we going to make it easy to get to people's, garages or not? So the question that we're dealing with for these access standards, and again, we'll be talking with engineering in more detail, really trying to sort this out, that interplay of engineering and zoning standards further with DLCD. But what we're trying to understand is, should triplexes and quadplexes be guaranteed multiple driveways? Should they be required to consolidate? Or, should it just depend on the situation? Which is so often the answer. But, you know, again, we sort of have to think about, there's corner lots, there's interior lots, there's local streets, there's busier streets, the arterials and collectors. And, you know, I think the other thing, you know, when we were working on duplexes, you know, it's one thing to say, let's have them use a single driveway because it's only 2 units. So both of them can use one driveway, but still have their garage directly attached to their dwelling unit. When we start getting to, say, a quadplex is our preferred term. If you only have one driveway, well, not everybody's garage is actually going to be, you know, attached to their unit. So, or it might not be, depending on whether they're stacked or side-by-side units. So there's definitely more complexity when we, you know, add the number of units. But, you know, I think that we came back to a very similar recommendation here, that to allow but not require multiple driveways for corner lots. So, you know, if it makes sense to have 2 different ones on the 2 streets of a corner lot, great. If not, you know, you certainly could use just one. And then on all other lots, to treat them the same as single family detached dwellings, so that, you know, you could only have multiple driveways if that 40-foot spacing in between driveways could be met, which requires a pretty wide lot and probably would disqualify a lot of lots. You know, when we start thinking about this, these are some of the diagrams from the model code. What we need to ensure is a guaranteed minimum of 32 feet of driveway per lot, which is an awful lot of driveway, but, you know, again, you're trying to serve a triplex or a quadplex there. But, you know, this diagram implies that there would be 4 separate driveways, and that is not necessarily a configuration that would meet the City of Newburgh's engineering standards. You know, it does not meet the city's spacing standards in between driveways. It's possible that there could be a way to configure this differently and get, you know, 2 pairs of 2 driveways that does meet the 40 feet, but we need to somehow allow that 32 feet, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to lift all of the other spacing and access restrictions that the city would normally apply to single family detached. Okay, and there are certainly some alternatives to just every unit having a driveway onto the street. So these also come from the model code, this idea that it could be accessed from an alley if there is one to the rear, but we can't require construction of new alleys. And then you see this corner option where the driveways come off of the 2 different local streets. So we can add these alternatives, but we can't mandate them in Newburgh's code. Okay, we have very similar challenges for townhouses. So, you know, honestly, I'm still trying to work through exactly what, you know, how to pull this all together. But I think townhouses are one of the bigger challenges because they're individual lots. And so, you know, as I read the model code, any lot that is at least 15 feet wide, which all of our townhouse lots would be as proposed, are guaranteed a driveway up to 12 feet directly onto a local street. And so that really, you know, this diagram is not to scale, right? That only leaves 3 feet of frontage that is not a driveway, which is certainly not enough room for a street tree or a fire hydrant, let alone on-street parking, and could really wind up with an awful lot of driveways. And there are, of course, you know, options in the model code for these alternative configurations, you know, as shown on the right here, but my understanding is those can't be mandated. So, you know, I think the question is really, can we live with this idea of every lot having its own driveway that takes up most of the frontage? And are there any options to sort of smush those driveways closer together or limit access, or that, you know, are there situations where alternative access can be required to prevent this, you know, overwhelming driveway presence? Okay. And the last topic to talk through tonight, I appreciate your patience, I know we're running close to time, is just, you know, to bring you back to the cottage cluster. You know, I think last time I was highlighting that this cottage orientation, having 50% of the units facing the common courtyard, having the common courtyard itself, you know, made up of 150 square feet per unit, and then the parking design, having options for shared parking areas as well as individual garages. Those are probably the most impactful of these concepts. You know, and our proposal is really just to integrate all of the design standards from the model code, the same diagrams that we saw last time. Apologize, I don't think that I put it in here. Just to save slides, but you know, no changes to the cottage cluster are being proposed with this initial draft, but still open to feedback on that. So that brings us to some discussion to wrap up our middle housing code tonight. So we already talked about the stream corridor issue, and so the areas where we're interested in your feedback is thinking about lot coverage and whether to increase in some zones or for housing types. Particularly that recommendation to go up to 60% for townhouses. I would not presume, but I think that based on our discussion of height, it makes sense to just keep the height as proposed for duplexes the same for these housing types. And then, further thoughts about this driveway and access issue, particularly on townhouses, and if you have any changes to the design standards overall that you'd like to see, or further questions that we can help clarify for you at our next meeting. With that, I am going to take a break from talking.
That's a lot to take in. We just went over a lot of information.
It's a lot. Thank you for bearing with me.
I'm taking notes and I'm thinking, boy, I need that slide back.
We will send this all out and I can go back to any slide right now.
Well, I'll start off, as far as the townhouse, 60% footprint, R1, be interesting to see if we actually have builders that want to build a townhome in R1. That seems to be, like we talked about earlier, it seems to be pretty high-end land for some of the affluent homes. But so I don't know if that's, if we change it to 60, are we going to have a bunch of people wanting to build townhomes and, utilizing that footprint? I don't know. What do you think?
I think there's a lot of incentives built into the townhouse code, in R1 to go from a 5,000 square foot lot down to 1,500 square feet. You could get 3 townhouses in the same amount of, as you say, expensive land, but still 3 townhouses, on the same amount of ground. You could really, if you're interested in building that model, it seems like there could be, some real opportunities there.
Be interested to see if it actually comes to fruition.
Right.
We went over the stream corridor. I agree the height should be the same, that might just end up causing conflict and confusion if we start adding any differences or disparities, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
More than we already have or need to. The driveway issue, I think each unit needs to stick with at least one driveway. I mean, we can manipulate them, but off-street parking per, one per unit minimum is something that I would encourage to reduce, neighborhood conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And then just out of curiosity, what did we change the, was it the zoning for, what was it, three plexes to a 5-plex for commercial or something like that? What was that?
Oh yeah, the definition of multifamily housing for apartments is going to change from 3 units and up to 5 units and up, because the new definitions for triplex will be 3 units on a lot, and quadplex will be 4 units on a lot. So that means that when you get to apartments, it needs to start at 5 rather than at 3.
That's interesting, because that's the way the banking world works. Anything 4 and below, I can get a 30-year fixed owner occupied. At 5, it becomes commercial. It's a whole different ball game. So interesting.
sometimes the universe lines up, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Thank you for that.
I also shared with, I forgot his name. I don't think we should move anything on the stream corridor.
Mhm.
'Cause they will increase more confusion than what it already is. About increasing the coverage on zones, in some zones.
Mhm.
Depends on which house are going to be building. and, and about that's the height of the zone is same thing, approaching to multiple driveways. I think if it's going to be one townhome or duplex, at least keep what you guys already have, one parking per unit. But if it's gonna be quadruple, maybe it would be nice to have two parking instead of just one. Just like he mentioned, it just to avoid problems with the neighborhood, and changing any designs. The designs that you were sharing are the ones that are gonna be built, or those are just suggestions?
Those are just diagrams, you know, trying to illustrate the standard. They're not necessarily, like, they're definitely not developed by architects or anything. You know, it's not a proposal that this would be a good design to build. Just trying to be an illustration of what would be possible.
Because I was thinking if someone builds something like that, maybe they can do the parking by the sides instead of the front street, and just put the numbers for the people of the units, and instead of put the parkings in front of the street, put the parking in the side of the house of the building. I think that's the only, if there's some changes to the designs, it will be only that, just to have more parking space. That way each person has their own parking, but they also can park in the street, rather than put the parking in the front of the street, and then there's no other space for them to park. If perhaps the husband has a car and the wife has a car, and where is gonna park? You know, I cannot explain it how I'm thinking right here, but what I'm saying is,
yeah, no, I can picture it.
Normally 2 cars per unit, and that would be helpful if they put the parkings for the unit in the side of the building, and then in the front of the street they can park another car in there. And because it's in the front of their own house, that's gonna avoid conflicts with their neighbors.
Right, and be convenient for those residents as well.
Yeah.
And just to say, you know, parking on the side is absolutely an option. Those diagrams are not meant to limit that option. It's just that sometimes it is more difficult or takes up more site area to get the parking over there. So we just can't require it, but it's absolutely an option. Thank you, Irma.
To tack onto what Irma said, it does seem like that is a bit of a troubling thing to figure out when the lots are smaller than, or the width is less than 20 feet. So maybe you could, between, what was it 12 foot minimum?
Yeah.
Between like 12 and 20, you could park on the side or back. I mean, I can see where there would be limitations if they're in the middle of a block and don't have that kind of access, but something along those lines where the parking is in the back, so you can have trees in front, and vegetation, and not just driveways. And I think that kind of thing really goes a long ways with how a place looks and how neighbors perceive them too. So let's see, the increase height, that seems fine. I guess I'm going backwards here. And then increase lot coverage. So the only thing I think, overall, I'm pro increasing the lot coverage. 40% does seem kind of low. But the resulting increase in the size per unit over 2,000 square feet, like that is a lot. So then I'm thinking, wow, we're gonna just have a lot of high-end, you know, duplexes and triplexes. And I guess I'm just gonna go with it in the spirit of increasing the amount of housing in general, because that's getting to be some pretty big houses.
Yeah, and again, like those are very rough calculations of if you fully maxed out the envelope and you had like a perfect rectangular lot, you know, there are lots where it would not work out that way. A, to build that much, or B, you know, as you say, like, do you really, you know, is anyone really going to build a high-end triplex? But it, you know, I think the thing that made me question it was, but that also has to include any garage space. And if we are wanting to encourage garage space, you know, to help deal with some of these off-street parking issues, then I think that, you know, it makes sense to increase the allowance to make sure that that doesn't become a limiting factor.
It's already so tight with these lot sizes. I mean, I'd be surprised if they put garages in them at all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's just not a lot to work with there, and maybe an R1, but we're definitely at a time where high density is getting more and more popular.
For the lot coverage and height, they'll go hand in hand together, because if we don't have enough, then we go high, and it's narrow and high. If there is enough to play with the lot size, then we can go wider and lower, because we can go wide enough to create the attic style space that can actually keep the structure lower than higher. It also gives there is the flexibility to add more daylight through skylights. As for the design area, I had a question. I'm not sure it's appropriate, but for the higher density and, for example, like the cottage style, is there a centralized garbage recycling, or every unit has, and I would say once a month you put up the glass, garbage, and recycling? You have 3 containers that you need to take outside, and at the end of the day, take them either in the backyard or inside of your garage. So I'm not sure how they approach the collection, because even the trucks then go from one to another, third, fourth. It's like a parade on the collection days.
Yeah, no, I don't think that question's inappropriate at all. And actually, you know, something that Doug had brought up earlier about, well, you know, multifamily apartments do have standards for, you know, centralized collection areas rather than bins for each unit. And so, yeah, we're looking at how to apply those. And, you know, I think that the cottage examples that I'm familiar with have a centralized garbage area, much like an apartment complex. And in fact, one that I know of, like, had to beef up their screening because they had bears getting into it. You know, bears like dumpsters, they're just like that. But yeah, with the way that cottages are arranged, you know, since they don't all have lot frontage, you know, on a public street, since they're clustered around that, you know, individual garbage truck isn't going to be able to pull up. And, you know, I think as you were saying, like, you don't necessarily want to drag all 3 of your bins all the way from the back corner of the lot up to the public street. So yeah, we're looking at how to apply those. The 3 and 4 units, there's also some question there about whether they would have individual or combined, but we'll be working through that. It's a good point to bring up. Other thoughts, Gabriel? Thank you. All right, Leslie, how about you?
Trying really hard to keep track.
Yeah,
I
one thing or all of them, whatever. What stands out to you?
Well, I'm definitely a pragmatic person, and I keep thinking about how this is played out. So I have a college student. She goes to George Fox, and I know that we're talking code and for builders and whatnot, but I mean, Doug, I assume you know the question, like how much of our housing is used up by George Fox College students? And we can regulate code, but we don't regulate how many people are in every building, right? So I got 4 girls in a 2-bedroom duplex, and they've all got a car. And so the way this plays out, you know, especially in a college town, I think is a little bit different than maybe a city without a college, because I think a lot of our middle to affordable housing is used up by college students. So all that, I don't know how to write the code to also assist or accommodate or take that into account. And I don't even know if that applies to this discussion at all. That's the only thing that's been in my mind.
Yeah, no, there's definitely some practical considerations there. I think that, you know, you're right to allude to the fact that the code can't necessarily distinguish between, oh, well, if you're going to use this unit for college students, you have to build it this way. And, you know, if you're not, you can build it this way. I don't know, Doug, when your HNA, is it going to address sort of the student housing needs, and what percentage or something of the local housing stock is used for that? Or does it just treat college students as, you know, residents, which they are, you know, in a way.
They are just residents. And
Okay.
so if you generally take that, you know, 2,500 undergrad students at Fox, take a number, you know, break it into 4s. Seniors can live off campus. Definitely. Juniors could. They built some more dorms, so it's part of the campus life to have students on the campus. Is that, yes, we have situations currently in town where somebody may have a 2-bedroom home and there are 4 to 5 students living in a 2-bedroom house, and each one has a car, and there's room to park 2 of those cars off the street, and then the other 2. And then we have congregations because we have property owners who rent to college students. I mean, that's their income stream for that unit. And so we have situations where we have residents who call us about, you know, parking issues. And so here, as you said, you know, we're dealing with the code and with the minimum per the administrative rule, but you're going to have situations where you're going to have college students are going to double, triple, quadruple up in a unit for cost measures. We're going to have families who have extended families, and you know, you may have grandparents, children's children who are all driving age, and you know, those are all nuances that we can't regulate that. I mean, those are lifestyle choices. But one common theme that this committee has brought up, and in the community survey work we did, was parking, 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 parking. How are we going to address the parking component? And I know and Robert heard this when going through the rulemaking process, is from rural communities who do not have the robust transit systems, Portland, TriMet, Chariots in Salem, LTD in Eugene, and so forth, is you're reliant on cars in rural communities to get someplace, to get to the grocery store, to get to your job, to get your kids to their recreational activities or educational activities. So there's that tension that's there between trying to resolve how do you park.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, when we talk about these access issues, sort of the two goals that I'm taking away from our conversation tonight is, allow driveways that maximize, make those off-street parking opportunities really usable, but also, consider how those driveways have an impact on how much on-street parking can be provided, and somehow try to maximize both so that, we don't just put in driveways that tear, parcel up the street into little tiny pieces of curb where no one can park.
Yeah. And so, we have some of that already in town where we have row houses and it's driveway after driveway after driveway, no street trees. How do you deal with the transformer? How do you deal with the boxes for cable?
Yeah.
How do all of those features all fit together when you have that development type that's going in?
All right, well, you can see that we have our work cut out for us. So just to sort of take us home here, we've got a lot of events coming up. Pretty intense time for developing this code. So all these issues will be mixing around and hopefully we'll be coming up with some revised ideas. We have an open house next week, next Tuesday evening. We'd love your help spreading it out to your friends, neighbors, networks. And then there'll be an online survey that runs to cover the same issues addressed in the open house, but get a broader participation for the next about 2.5 weeks after that. And then we will come back for our next advisory committee meeting in about 3 weeks. So March 10th, and we will be having, a final-ish version of these other middle housing types. It'll be refined based on our discussion and other input. We'll take another look at the duplexes based on our conversation and see if we have any other, changes to make on that. But that will be our last chance to get to meet and get your input on those before we move on to the adoption phase. The Planning Commission and City Council is going to take up the duplexes on March 15th with an initial work session before moving into some public hearings in April through June to get that done. So but March 10th will be our last meeting. And I say final version, but again, it should be our final recommended duplex version, but because the other middle housing types are in a different adoption timeline, there still could be some opportunities for revision through the adoption process. So that's all that I've got. Thank you all. And let's see, I think, Doug, I'll turn it back over to you for any concluding thoughts. Do we have any public comment?
I was going to ask Robert, what do you think? You've got to spend two hours with us listening to all of Newburgh's issues.
Yeah, no, I mean, this sounds great. You guys are on track with this project, and it looks good. So all the recommendations that Elizabeth has been making are, they sound really great for what we're looking for in these type of projects, and hopefully it's going to work out for the city to increase the housing supply and get some good housing units there in the city. And I apologize, this is my first meeting here. Usually our regional representatives attend these meetings, but our regional rep position here in the Mid Valley is currently vacant. So I apologize. This is the first one I've been at.
That's okay. Angela's off, living the ultimate cold right now. So she's paying the consequences.
She is. She wants to be in Michigan, so that's it.
I will get out an email to the committee tomorrow on the open house so that you can share that. I know Lacey has been pushing it out on social media. I didn't check the webpage today, but she was going to be modifying that. Monday was a holiday, so I couldn't ask her to work on a Monday, but she was supposed to do that on Tuesday. So that'll go on. So if you like to push that out to individuals that you're aware of, We have the interested parties list from our prior survey, and that will be going out to those individuals tomorrow as well on the open house. So I guess I would conclude by thanking all of you. It is a lot of material. It's technical. There's still some tweaks and revisions. As Elizabeth said, we've got a meeting with our engineering division tomorrow. We're looking at some of how these code language provisions fit into our public works standards and code provisions that we have to try to work through those. So there will be some tweaks to things that you saw tonight on duplexes. Definitely some tweaks on the other middle housing as well as we continue to move forward. So thank you.
Cool. Just like to thank staff for all their hard work.
You're welcome. Have a good rest of your evening, and hopefully we'll see a number of you at the open house. And if not, we'll definitely see you on March 10th.
Thank you all.
everyone.